for diagnosing, like we do the HIV. So first we apply a more sensitive test and then we apply a more specific test. But ultimate desire of both the test is same, and the mathematical process which we use to assess the accuracy of these two tests, whether we are using it as a screening test or we are using it as a diagnostic test, that is same. So now, which of the following can be a diagnostic information? In this case, so like a new imaging modality, yes, it is a diagnostic tool. A questionnaire, many a time like PHQ-9 or in psychiatry or many a times there is a tool which is a questionnaire, and the basis of score, we identify whether the person is diseased or non-diseased. From the clinical history, definitely, this is also a diagnostic information, because you have a clinical suspicion of something, then only you send that person for a particular diagnostic study. There is a new assessment tool, your medical examination findings, a value of a biomarker, checklist. Many times we can use the checklist also to have a diagnosis. We can have a genetic study. So genetic studies, genetic markers, they are also under the diagnostic studies. And then there can be like forensic examination. So like post-mortem examination, sending your viscera for the clinical value of the marker. So these forensic examination are again a diagnostic information. So in this case, these all options can be a modality of diagnostic information, and you can apply the diagnostic accuracy studies for all these diagnostic information. So now, what are the sources of information for this presumptive diagnosis? So generally we start as a clinician, we always start with the medical history. We ask from the patient and we record their narrative. We do the examination, we do some lab testing, we do order the investigation for radiological imaging, and then we can get these pathological specimen for biopsy, for histopathological clinical examination. These things can be done. So these are the sources for the presumptive diagnosis of this overall scenario. Now, how to conduct a diagnostic test study? So we will discuss a few options how you can plan a diagnostic test study. So in this case, usually this is a general guideline. Generally, we start with the cases. So we select cases, and in this we avoid inappropriate exclusion. So we have a very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, and based on that we select cases. After we have selected the cases, we apply index test to all selected cases. So generally, we first apply the index test. And what is an index test? The new testing modality which we want to test, that is known as the index test. So first we apply the index test on all the selected individual, and then we apply the reference test to all the selected cases. But there should be a very less time gap between these two tests. Why? Because if you take too much of time in applying, like if you have applied first test and then maybe you have left that person for 15 days and then you're applying the second test, in that 15 days, the disease course might change. The patient may be becoming well, and then you have applied this reference test. So there will be misleading information. That's why we say that the time interval between these two tests, application of the index test and the reference test, it should be very less. Then we have to make a 2x2 table, and we have to calculate the statistical measure, appropriate statistical measure, which we have read. So now there are few study designs which are recommended whenever we plan a diagnostic test accuracy study. So the first and most commonly used is a cross-sectional study, which is known as the diagnostic accuracy cross-sectional study. The second is a diagnostic accuracy case control study, The third type is a diagnostic accuracy comparative study. And the fourth and the most robust is the diagnostic testing accuracy randomized trial. So I'll not be talking in detail regarding this diagnostic accuracy randomized trial, but the experts, they recommend like we do testing or we test intervention using a randomized control trial. Similarly, we should test these diagnostic modality also using a randomized trial. And we can randomize the two diagnostic tests to the individual. Like we did do the analysis of randomized clinical trial, we should conduct the randomized accuracy trial of a diagnostic study. But that is seldom ever done. Usually the most commonly done modality of these test accuracy is the first one, which is the diagnostic accuracy cross-sectional study. We have reviewed a lot of literature, and mostly we have found out that most authors, they conduct the first option, that is the diagnostic accuracy cross-sectional study. We could find out some example of diagnostic accuracy comparative study also. So I hope I'm clear that with all these four types, you can design a diagnostic accuracy studies. Now, coming to the first type and the most commonly used type, which is the diagnostic accuracy cross-sectional study. So diagnostic accuracy cross-sectional study is the most commonly used design that we have reiterated many a time. And in this design, what we do, we select patients based on some inclusion and exclusion criteria. We enroll them together, and then they are exposed to the same index test first, and then they are exposed to the reference test. And we have learned that the time gap between these two should be very minimal so that the natural course of the disease should not change, because otherwise it will be a bias study. So the steps is, the first you will select the cases, then you apply the index test, then you apply the reference test, and then you do a 2x2 table and you measure the diagnostic accuracy. So this is the broad step how we should be conducting a cross-sectional type of diagnostic accuracy study. So there's a question for you people. There's an index test X1. You have tested its diagnostic accuracy in a hospital A using a reference standard or a gold standard R. And the sensitivity of this X1 is reported as 85%. There's another index test X2, and you have tested the diagnostic accuracy of this test in hospital B. So read it as hospital B. It is not the A. So both are done or tested in two hospitals using a reference standard R. The sensitivity of this X2 is reported as 90%. So can we compare the sensitivity of X1 and X2? Please answer yes or no. So answer will be no. Why no? Because they are done on the different set of individual. They are not the same set of individual. That's why we cannot compare. So in the study design, you should definitely take care of this point, that it should be the same set of individual where we should be doing the test, both the index test and the reference test. So it is not possible to compare the accuracy using a different test which was not studied. Now the second type is less commonly used method, which is the diagnostic accuracy case control study. So is my voice is not going properly? So any participants?
It is fine. It is fine.
Who is feeling that I'm not audible? In that case, there may be some issue from your end. Otherwise, you will get the recording of this session. So no need to worry. So now the second is the diagnostic accuracy case control study, which is a less commonly used method. In this case, like we design a typical case control study, so you start with the cases which are with the disease. So suppose if I've got the sample of only positive case, then I may take a control that will be without the disease, And then I will perform my index case first on both these two sets. And then I will apply my standard or the reference test on these two groups. And then I will make a 2x2 table and I'll measure the diagnostic accuracy. In this case, I just want to emphasize that the cases without the disease in this case should not be a separate, entirely healthy control. It should be very much similar to the disease. The only thing that it should be lying behind it. And we will learn it from an example. So a group of known cases will be used to calculate sensitivity. And this sensitivity we will calculate on the group which we know that they are the cases. And the group of control will be used to compute specificity. Like in this case, if I take example of there's a this brainstem death. So if I want to use this CT scan as a diagnosis of brainstem death, the classical diagnosis or the gold standard for brainstem death is the clinical examination. When we see the pupil and we see that it is fixed, we call it as a brainstem death. But if we want to use CT as an alternative to this clinical examination, like if the patient face, if there's a road traffic accident and the patient face, it has been crushed and I cannot see the pupil. So I just want to see, use the maybe CT scan or some other imaging modality to understand whether the brainstem death is there or not. In that case, the control will be any other brainstem injury patient, maybe which might go into the brainstem death after 4 to 5 days. So in this case, this control is slightly different from the control which we use as a case control study. So here the control, because if you take exactly healthy thing, it will definitely, the test will be 100% specific. But we want a very similar type of cases. That means a clear-cut brainstem and a suspicious of brainstem. So that suspicious of brainstem will be your control. So that should be your selection of control. Now the third type is the diagnostic accuracy comparative study. So this diagnostic accuracy comparative study, here we compare more than one test against a reference standard. So in the step 1, we do the case selection. In step 2, we apply the index test 1. So remember, in case of a diagnostic test comparative study, we select at least 2 tests as compared to a reference test. So we apply index test 1 on the set of individual. Then we apply index test 2. And then we apply the reference test. And in step 4, we do the diagnostic accuracy measurement. So these are the steps for the comparative study. So this randomized control trial, which is the 4th type, I am not discussing that because that is usually that is never done. Ideally, it should be done. Yes, that's a gold standard diagnostic test method. And all the literature, it is recommending that we should be using randomized control trial for testing the efficacy of the diagnostic tests also, like we do it for the clinical intervention. Therapeutic intervention, it heavily rely on the accuracy of such diagnostic information. That's why these randomized control trial should be done, where we randomize the 2 diagnostic tests to the 2 group. So we have done a thorough literature review and we have found out that generally, and there were many review articles also for these diagnostic studies, and they found out that out of 4,000 or 5,000 articles, there were very few articles, you can count them, they did the sample size calculation. So ideally, very few people do the sample size calculation for studies who are addressing this diagnostic accuracy. Mostly, they do a convenient sampling and they do it on a convenient set of individual. So they later on, they do the power calculation and maybe the other diagnostic imaging accuracy examples, but usually they never do the sample size calculation before they have planned for the diagnostic accuracy studies. That's why in today's session, you will find that we could not elicit any example where they have actually calculated the sample size. So that's why we have taken their result as a reference and we have calculated the sample size, which means like if you have to do a diagnostic test accuracy in your setting and you want to calculate the sample size, then you can do it like that. So it depends whether you are doing an estimation or you are doing a hypothesis testing. So in case of an estimation, you should have an anticipated sensitivity, specificity of the index case. You should have a minimal clinical acceptable margin of error, and you should have a decider for a level of significance. For input needed for hypothesis testing, you should have an anticipated sensitivity or specificity for the index test 1, and you should have an anticipated sensitivity and specificity for the index test 2, or you can preset it. That we do. For a one sample hypothesis testing, you have to do a preset value for these hypothesis testing. You should have a significance level, the power of the study, and the nature of hypothesis, whether it is a one-sided hypothesis or a two-sided hypothesis. And the basics of these concepts regarding the level of significance, power of the study, nature of the hypothesis, we have discussed in the first and second session of the webinar of this sample size maze easy. So now this, let's see the sample size calculation for diagnostic test accuracy studies when the outcome is positive or negative. That means binary. So now for estimation, when there are two scenarios. When the true disease status is known, that means the prevalence of that disease is known. And in that case, if you plan to estimate the sensitivity and the specificity of index test, how you should be going. So the first scenario is sensitivity and specificity based on these two values. We will do the input, but in this case, the prevalence of the disease or the situation is not known. So we use a single proportion formula by Cochrane to calculate the required sample size. So in this case, this V, it represents the desired level of statistical significance, and it is typically 1.96 for 5% of alpha level. This P is the expected sensitivity or specificity of the index test, which we want to test. And this 1 minus P is either 1 minus sensitivity or 1 minus specificity, whatever value of input we are taking. And this D is the minimum clinical desired precision. So it can be 5%, 10% based on your assumption. So this is the formula which runs in the background if you use a calculation of sensitivity or specificity with unknown prevalence. Now, the second scenario could be that the disease status is known. That means the prevalence of the disease is known. In that case, if I want to plan to estimate the sensitivity or taking the specificity, and if I want to calculate the sample size, then this is the same formula, and we divide this whole formula by the prevalence. So again, this V is the desired level of statistical significance, and the value of this at 5% alpha is 1.96. This is sensitivity, and this is the clinical desired precision. On this prevalence is the prevalence of disease or condition. So in case the prevalence is known, you should divide this, it should come in the denominator. So this is the formula for the sample size calculation. For specificity, again, it is the same. You just replace this sensitivity by the term specificity. But in that case, in the denominator, it will be the 1 minus prevalence, because the prevalence denotes the disease situation and the specificity is regarding the true negative. So in the denominator, it should be the non-diseased, and non-diseased will be the 1 minus prevalence. That's why in the denominator, we take this as a 1 minus prevalence. So again, this V is the desired level of statistical significance, which is the value is 1.96. We take as 5% alpha level. This is specificity, and we multiply it with 1 minus specificity. This D is the desired clinical precision. You can take it as 2%, 5%, 10%, depending on your assumption. And this 1 minus prevalence is the non-diseased person, which you take as a denominator. So you have two measures. You can calculate it using a sensitivity or a specificity. And the larger of the two, you will take it as your sample size. Because if you take the larger one, it will satisfy the sample size criteria for the smaller one also. So the rule is you calculate the sample size independently using both sensitivity and specificity. And then you take the sample size which is larger. So the calculated sample size, whichever is the larger, using these input, you will take that sample size in your calculation. Now let's see with the example how we can do this calculation. So this is one article where this article, you can see this. The title of this article was Role of C-reactive protein in Early Onset Neonatal Sepsis. So the diagnostic test I want to use here is the C-reactive protein, and there is a gold standard for this neonatal sepsis. But I want to use this C-reactive protein as a diagnostic test. So the objective was to evaluate the C-reactive protein in the diagnosis of early onset sepsis in neonate, and the value of the CRP cutoff is the 10 milligram per deciliter. So less than 10, I have taken it as a no, this, and this EOS is the early onset sepsis. No sepsis, and more than 10 is the sepsis. So now the assumed sensitivity of CRP in diagnosing early onset sepsis is, we have considered 70% in this case. Now there was a question how we can determine its sensitivity and specificity. So in the previous sessions also we have discussed this, that the sensitivity and specificity, this we take it as an early reference. That means you review the literature, you can take the reference of the previous studies done, and you can take their sensitivity and specificity in your sample size calculation. First is this method, and we have discussed this earlier also. So extensive literature review will give you the estimate of these inputs. The second way is to do a guess. Guesswork means maybe you are expert and you think that this should be the sensitivity and specificity, so you can calculate this. The third is by the discussing it with the other your colleague. So there can be 3 or 4 experts, and together you can decide like what sensitivity and specificity you should take while sample size calculation. But most commonly we take the previous literature and we take the value of already who has done already. So this 70 and 75%, maybe we have taken their sensitivity and specificity of CRP. And now if I want to plan the same study in my setting, how will I do? And the desired precision is 10%. I have taken, and the prevalence of early onset sepsis in hospital setting, in my hospital setting, is the 24%. So this is the prevalence of the disorder. So remember, we will apply a sample size formula where we divide this whole proportion sample size by the prevalence if we are using sensitivity. And if we are using specificity, we divide it by the 1 minus prevalence. So in this case, we will go to the statue later. So remember, this is, if I have to remember the values. So assumed sensitivity for diagnosing early onset is 70% and specificity is 75%. And the prevalence is 24%. And the precision is thus 10%. So you should remember these Now we will go to the statulator. So here we will apply a single proportion. So this 95% will be the level of confidence in this expected proportion. Actually, this is the sensitivity and specificity, because sensitivity and specificity is again a proportion. So initially I will calculate it with the 70% of sensitivity. So I will make this 0.70, which will be the 70% of specificity. And then this precision is, it will be 10%. So it is 0.10. I will, and in the adjustment, because if you have to divide it by the prevalence, how you are going to do it? So by in the adjustment, if you do this response rate as 24%, so I will do 0.24 here, and then I'll update it, and then I'll do the calculation part. So it will be 337. So 337 individual, they are needed if I want to test the CRP in my setting. Sensitivity, using sensitivity. So remember, this is 337. Now I will use specificity, because what I said, you have to calculate the sample size using sensitivity separately, using specificity separately, and whose is the larger, you have to take that. So if I use 0.75, because specificity was 0.75, so I have taken it as a 0.75. So the 0.75, but again, adjustment needs to be done here. I will do 0.76, because it will be the 1 minus prevalence. So if you calculate the sample size, it is 95. So we take the required sample size calculation is 95 with specificity, and it is 337 with sensitivity. So that's why I will take the sensitivity, because this is the larger sample size. So the sample size calculation for this study would be 337. So did you get this? Now coming to the second example. So this was the first example. I will again repeat. You calculate the sample size using sensitivity. You calculate the sample size using specificity, and then you do the this calculation, and whosoever is large, you can calculate that sample size. In this case, I hope you have understood this response rate. Response rate is only we have calculated. If you don't want to use that response rate, then you can use this calculator also, because in calculator then you can decide that 100 in 100 for 24 cases we need 100 cases. That's why for those many cases how much we will use. So similarly you can do that. Now second is the early onset sepsis versus MR. No, this EUS is the endoscopic ultrasound versus MRCP for detection of choledolithiasis, because that there was a term EUS also that we have done in the previous example for the CRP. This is EUS, which is the endoscopic ultrasound, versus the MRCP for the detection of choledolithiasis. So this was a study, and here we have compared the diagnostic performance of this EUS, and the gold standard here is the ERCP. So the sample size for this study, this assumption is the sensitivity of this MRCP is 85%. The assumed specificity of MRCP is 95%. The level of significance, it is the 95%. By mistake, it is written here 5%. And the desired precision is 5%. And the prevalence of choledolithiasis in the hospital setting is 20%. Now, how to do this calculation? So 85% is the sensitivity and 95 is the specificity. So I'll go to the statulator. In the statulator, if you have seen the interface of statulator, there is a sample size menu, and from this drop down menu, we will select a single proportion. So I have clicked this single proportion, and then in the input, this level of confidence, it is 0.95. It is the fixed value. Expected proportion in this case, if I take the sensitivity, it will be 0.85. So I have done this 0.85 and the precision or the margin of error is 5%, and then you calculate it. So if you don't take prevalence, it will be 196. But I have to take prevalence also, and prevalence is 20%. So 20%, that means in 100, for 20 cases, I have to take 100 individual. That's why if you have to take 196, how many will you take? So either you can divide it by prevalence, that means you can divide it by 0.2, or you can adjust it because this response rate is similar to this 0.2. So if I can add this response, if I make it as 0.20 and update it, so 980 will be the desired sample size. Now, if I want to use specificity, so what I'll do, I'll make this as 0.95, and this adjustment thing, I have to make it as a 80% because I have to take 1 minus prevalence, and then you update it. So the calculated sample size is much less with the specificity in contrast with the sensitivity. But in generally, for any screening or diagnostic test, the first thing which we want is to have a good screening capacity. So that's why, but it is again up to you which screening modality or which input you want to take. Do you want to take sensitivity and specificity in as a calculation of sample size? So this was the two example. Now let's see. Now it's your time to do the calculation. So for you, this is one example, that diagnostic accuracy in case of a fungal ball. And here the diagnostic accuracy, it is the CT scan. So the gold standard is the operative finding, and CT scan is the diagnostic, the index test. So for prevalence, for this specificity, we remember the calculation of sample size. So when we take this specificity in denominator, we take it as a 1 minus prevalence. So if the prevalence is 20%, in the denominator, if we are taking specificity as an input, we will divide it by the 1 minus prevalence. That will be the 80%. Remember? So if you are taking sensitivity, you have to correct it for the prevalence. If you are taking the specificity, you divide this whole by 1 minus prevalence. So if the prevalence is 20%, so in case of a specificity, you will divide it by 80%. That means 0.8. Are you people getting it? How in specificity we, because specificity is about true negative. So true negative is you have to take the healthy person. So that healthy will be the people who are not diseased. So the prevalence is 20%. That means the diseased population is 20%. So that's why we have to divide it by the 1 minus prevalence. That will be the 80%. So this is for you people. You all have, please do this calculation. I will show you the input. So the sensitivity of CT scan in patients with suspected invasive fungal sinusitis, taking histopathology as a gold standard. So the assumed sensitivity of CT scan in diagnosing. So we have taken the author's sensitivity in this case. Remember, if you see this article in the PubMed or Google Scholar, you will find that the author has reported 62% of sensitivity of CT scan in diagnosing fungal ball. That author has not calculated any sample size for his study. But if I have to do that study, I will take his sensitivity as an input. So I have taken his sensitivity, that is this 62%, the level of significance 5%, the desired precision is 10%, and the prevalence of fungal ball in chronic sinusitis patient at hospital setting is 40%. So how to do that? So I think few of you have calculated it. So it is the 10%, 40%, because I will also have to write it down, 62%. So we'll go to the statulator. We'll use a single proportion. So this 0.95 will be the same. This expected proportion here will be 0.85. This absolute will be 0.1 here because the precision I am taking it as 10%. And then I have calculated this. And then if I have to adjust it with the prevalence, so the prevalence was 40%. So I will take this as 0.40. I'll update this, and this is 123. How come it was 227 from you people? It is 90. Okay, it was 62. Sorry, I took it as a, I'm sorry. So it was 0.62. Yes, you are right. I always do such errors. So it is 227. So you are right. It is 227. I'm sorry. So 227 using the corrective because I was taking it by mistake as 85%. So this, you people are right. So now we'll go to the second example. That is the acute appendicitis diagnostic. So in this case, in the second example, we have to see the diagnostic accuracy of a Alvarado scoring system. So there is a Alvarado scoring system, and based on that cutoff, the person decide whether the disease is, whether the patient is having acute appendicitis or not having acute appendicitis. So the aim of our study is to evaluate the usefulness of Alvarado scoring system in reducing the percentage of a negative appendicectomy in our setup. So this Alvarado scoring system, if you see this, it gives a score like symptoms, this pain, right iliac fossa pain, vomiting, anorexia as 1, the signs tenderness as 2, elevation of temperature as 1, and then this leukocytosis as 2, and neutrophilic shift as more than 75% as 1. So total score is 10. So based on Alvarado score, the patient is divided into two groups. A group of patients having less than 6, not having the appendicitis, and group of patients having more than 6 or equal to 6 having appendicitis. So based on that cutoff, we have assumed this following assumption. So the assumed sensitivity of Alvarado in diagnosing acute appendicitis is 70%. The specificity is 75%. The level of significance and the cutoff we have used as 6. And level of significance is 5%. The desired precision as 10%. And the ultrasound examination showed, because the showed the sign suggestive of appendicitis, and that means the prevalence is 55% in those patients where on the basis of, so these patients are the prevalence. What do we mean? It is not the prevalence as compared to the healthy one, the based on symptoms, because you will definitely write the investigation if you clinically have this suspicion. So this prevalence is 55% in this case. So you can calculate it. So there are two values. I should write it very carefully because yes, one of the participants said that people are awake. That's why I should not be doing any error. So 75%, 5% is the precision, 10% is the desired precision. Level of significance is 95. Don't confuse, that is error from our side. And this 55 is the 95% confidence or error. Yes, whatever you take. Because in the input we write 95%. That's why I thought maybe you may get confused. And this is for the single proportion. So I will take 70% initially. So this is 70. And then this again 10%. And then this thing is as a correction will be the 55. So I have calculated this, and in adjustment, I'll make this as 0.55 and then update this. So the calculated sample size is 147. Yes. And if you have to use this specificity, then specificity is 75%. So I will write 147 calculated sample sizes with the sensitivity. And if I am using this specificity with 10%, again, in the case of specificity, if I have to adjust it, the prevalence is 55. So I have to take here as a 45. So disease will be the 45. And then this non-diseased, and then the calculated sample size is 161. So 147 versus 161. So what we have learned that the larger sample size we will take in our calculation. So I will take 161 sample. And if you can recall the study design, so what I'll do, all that 161 individual who are suspicious of having this acute appendicitis, I will first do my index testing. That means scoring system. And then the reference testing, make a 2x2 table, and then calculate the sensitivity, specificity of my study. Remember, I have used this sensitivity and specificity of a previous literature, but I want to calculate this sensitivity specificity in my setup. So I have used their sensitivity specificity only for calculation of my sample size. Am I making myself clear to all of you regarding this sensitivity and specificity as an input from the previous study and calculating the sensitivity and specificity in my setting? So now coming to another example. So this was the example. If you have a prevalence or if you don't have a prevalence of a disease situation when you have a categorical or a binary variable. Now, if I have to compare the sensitivity and specificity of a test to a pre-specified value, in this case, this will be a hypothesis testing. Like we do a one sample test. When we set that the mean, what I expect should be this and my sample mean is this. Similarly, in this case, we will use this. So hypothesis testing, because the previous one was an estimate. In sample size, we use two setup, we do an estimate or we do a hypothesis testing. In this second scenario, in the case of a hypothesis testing, we calculate the sample size using a test sensitivity and specificity of single test, but we calculate this against a preset specific value. So this is the one proportion hypothesis testing formula, where this V represents the desired level of statistical significance, which is 1.96 at 5% alpha. This U represents the desired power, because here now there will be power also. Whenever you do this hypothesis testing, you calculate the beta error and you do the power. So you fix the power here as 80%. And then this P0 is a preset value of sensitivity or specificity of an index test. And this P1 is the expected value of sensitivity or specificity under the research hypothesis. So now this is one example. Here, I have to measure the accuracy of MRI for detecting cerebral aneurysm. So the catheter angiography, that is the gold standard or the traditional test for the presence of cerebral aneurysm. And we have discussed that although there is a gold standard, but that gold standard can be very costly, it can be invasive, it can be suffocative, it can be non-accepted by the patient. So that's why even if the gold standard may delineate the case to a near accuracy, there is a need for other index tests also. And in this case, since catheter angiography, it is a traditional test, it is a gold standard, but since it is invasive, if there can be another modalities which is non-invasive like MRI or CT, definitely one would like to offer these tests to the patients. So from literature, I know that CT has a sensitivity of 0.85. And based on the previous of experience, I expect that my sensitivity of this MRI will be closer to 0.90. So if I want to test the sensitivity of my MRI, so I will take 0.85 as a null and 0.90 as a alternate hypothesis. So, but again, this is a single hypothesis testing. So the sample size, the input which are needed for calculation of sample size, expected sensitivity of MRI for diagnosis. So this is the expected is 90%. The minimum pre-specified is 85%. So I have said that at least it should be as sensitive as CT, which is known. So the minimum should be 85% and the expected is 90%. The level of significance is 5%. The power of the study is 80%. And the alternative hypothesis, it is a two-sided hypothesis. So I will use another calculator because Statulator doesn't have this calculator in this drop-down menu. So there is another calculator. You will find the link of all these calculators in our presentation. And we have this idea of having all these calculators at one place in our website, that is the meritindia.org. So either you can go to this presentation and see what is the calculator. Right now, I think if we can paste it in the chat box, is it possible? Okay, so we have pasted this calculator in the chat box. But again, since there's a lot of chat going on, so I don't want you to scroll up to to that extent. So we will again copy and paste this calculator here, so that you people should not get confused regarding this tabulator and this calculator. So because this is there, I will go to this calculator. So here you can see this is an inference for single proportion comparing to a known proportion, hypothesis testing. So I have to calculate the sample size here. So the P0 and P1. So the null hypothesis, it says that it will be at least 0.85. And my assumption, it says that MRI should be at least 0.90. So it is again two-sided hypothesis. Alpha is 5% and the power is 80%. So if I calculate, the calculated sample size is 363. So with the P0 0.85, P1 0.90, and why I have taken this P0 as 0.85? Because from the previous study, CT has a known sensitivity of 85%. So I want that at least 85% should be there, but I expect that it will go by 90%. That's why I have taken 0.90. Again, this is the way. Again, I will go back to the presentation. And here we'll see another example. So, okay, so this was the one example of a single hypothesis testing. Now, if you want to estimate and compare diagnostic accuracy of two index tests, remember in that comparative type of diagnostic test accuracy studies. So we read 4 types of tests: a diagnostic accuracy cross-section test, a diagnostic accuracy case control, a diagnostic accuracy comparative test, and a diagnostic accuracy randomized control trial. So if you are comparing more than one diagnostic test, it comes under the heading of estimating and comparing diagnostic accuracy of two index tests. In this case, we do the hypothesis testing and we calculate the sample size using the sensitivity or specificity of the two diagnostic tests, or you can take the this accuracy also of the two index test. So in this case, we will use the two sample formula, two proportion formula, not sample, I'm sorry, two proportion, comparison of two proportion, which we do in the statulator. So this is a sample size formula when you have to compare the two independent proportion. So this U is represents the desired power. This is 80%. This V is represents the desired level of statistical significance, which is 1.96 for 5% at 5% level of alpha. And this P1 is the expected sensitivity or specificity for index test 1 and index test 2. And this is the average proportion, that is the P1 plus P2 by 2. So this is a sample size formula which is running in the background. So now, this is the question. Is there a difference in diagnostic accuracy and clinical impact between endoscopic ultrasonography and magnetic resonance cholangiopancreatography? So the two diagnostic test is the endoscopic ultrasonography and the MRCP. And the gold standard is the ERCP. In this case, we have taken this from the study that many studies have shown that the endoscopic ultrasonography and the magnetic resonance cholangiopancreatography are investigation with a diagnostic accuracy comparable to that of the endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography, which is known as ERCP. Thus, it is generally accepted that either EUS, which is the endoscopic ultrasonography, or MRCP should replace diagnostic ERCP because of a high complication risk associated with the procedure. So, however, it is still not known whether there is a difference in diagnostic accuracy in clinical impact between the EUS and MRCP. So now they have conducted this study. So they have not calculated the sample size, but from the literature we have taken, they have reported the diagnostic accuracy of MRCP as 85%, diagnostic accuracy of EUS as 95%, level of significance as 5%, and the alternative hypothesis is two-sided. So if we see here, we will use the two proportion formula from the statulator. So the two proportion are the 85 and 95% using a two-sided. So I'll go to the statulator. And in this case, from the drop-down menu, I will use the two independent proportion. So in the two independent proportion, you see the expected outcome in the reference group and in the test group. So it is 0.95 in one group, and in the other group, it was 0.85. So 0.95, 0.85, and then if you don't adjust, it takes like option as 80% and 5%. So this is as such, and now calculate. So if you calculate, the sample size is 157. But it will calculate the sample size 157, but in each group. That means the total sample size will be 314. That means you will take 314 individual and you will administer the index test 1, then index test 2, and then you will again do a reference test. And that's how you can do the analysis. So this was regarding the two proportion. Another example for these two proportion, diagnostic accuracy of two questionnaire for detection of neuropathic pain in the Spanish population. So they have used two questionnaire method. So the study aimed to compare the diagnostic accuracy of the Leeds assessment of neuropathic symptoms and sign, which is the Lance pain scale, and Dollier neuropathic N4 question, which is the DN4 questionnaire, for the detection of peripheral neuropathic pain in the Spanish population. So they have taken the cutoff, they have recommended the cutoff value of 4 for the DN4 and more than equal to 12 for the Lance. That means if the score is more than equal to 12, there is a pain of neuropathic pain. And if they're using the DN4 question, more than equal to 4 is the, that means there is a neuropathic pain. So using these cutoff, we have taken the, again, now what we are doing, we have taken the sensitivity and specificity using this cutoff. So the assumed sensitivity of DN4 questionnaire is 95% and the assumed sensitivity of Lance questionnaire is 80%. So 95 and 80. And if you so you go to 95 and instead of 85, you do this 80. So it will be 86. So now coming to another example. So now it's your time to practice. So now if you are comparing the two rapid Streptococcus pyogenes diagnostic test with the rigorous culture standard. So the gold standard is the culture standard and the Streptococcus pyogenes, the two diagnostic tests, that is your index test 1 and the index test 2. So the current strategy for the diagnosis of Streptococcus pyogenes pharyngitis, it incorporates the use of clinical judgment and throat culture and rapid antigen test. So there are two rapid antigen tests that were compared using this multiple culture standard defined as the identification of Strep pyogenes from the 4 culture plate. So the sample size for this study, you have to calculate using the assumed sensitivity of this Streptococcus A, that is 90%, and the assumed sensitivity of this max test is the 70%. So please calculate. And in that calculation statulator, the sample size which comes, that will be the, don't double the sample size because that is using the two tests. So here you don't have to calculate. It will be 69. So is it clear to all of you? Okay. So now the sample size for the diagnostic test study. So sample size for diagnostic test study, what we have discussed, when the outcome is continuous in nature. And the continuous nature of outcome means either it is on a numerical scale or on the ordinal scale. So in both the cases, the output will be in the form of a continuous variable. So we have got two options. Either we can make a categorical variable using a cutoff, or we can use a AUC. Now, what is a AUC? AUC, the full form of AUC is the area under the curve. So we plot a ROC curve, and then we see that what is the differentiation index, or what if it is very strong or if it is weak in nature. So we use the assumption of sample size calculation based on the area under the curve, which is known as the AUC. So AUC is a indicator where we use this indicator, we plot a ROC, and then we see that using that ROC, what is the discrimination index. So AUC is a measure of discrimination index. If the value of AUC is 0.5, that means it has got no discrimination. So 0.5 to 0.6, no discrimination. 0.6 to 0.7 is a poor discrimination. We are not going into the detail of the AUC and ROC. That you can see in our videos, which are there in the Merit India website. There is a session on ROC. So you will learn the underlying concepts there. Then if the AUC value is between 0.7 to 0.8, it is an acceptable discrimination. So it should be at least more than 0.7. 0.8 to 0.9 is a good discrimination, and 0.9 to 1 is an excellent discrimination. Now, what is all about this discrimination? So this discrimination is the ability to differentiate the diseased from non-diseased. That's how we mean here by the term discrimination. So when the index test is continuous, then there are three types of studies that are possible, as we have discussed earlier. So you can either do an estimation of a diagnostic accuracy of a single index test, like we have done for the proportion, or you can do the diagnostic testing accuracy, that is the AUC, of a single index test against a preset value. Or the third option is to estimate and compare the diagnostic accuracy of two index tests. So there are three types of research design is possible if you take AUC as a criteria. So when the index tests are continuous in nature, then first we need to decide whether this diagnostic test has a sufficient discrimination or not. So if the AUC is more than 0.7, then only we will try to find out the cutoff point for the best value of sensitivity and specificity. Because for every cutoff, there is a sensitivity and specificity. So now if I have to use this AUC using a single index test, how I can do that? So this is one example where I have to see the performance of lactate in discriminating bacterial meningitis from the enteroviral meningitis. So this lactate, we are measuring it in the CSF. And in the CSF fluid, I have to see whether this lactate can discriminate the bacterial meningitis from the enteroviral meningitis. So in the present study, the author has aimed the sensitivity of the CSF lactate as a distinction between the bacterial meningitis and enteroviral meningitis as compared to other CSF parameter. So here he has used only sensitivity. So it is up to you. If for you, because sensitivity and specificity both have their unique characteristics. If you want to have use it like a screening test, then obviously for you sensitivity is more important. If you want a confirmatory test, then definitely the specificity is more important for you. So depend on the investigator. In this case, for author, it was the sensitivity which matters more than the specificity. So you can specify in your sample size calculation also. If you don't want to calculate the sample size using both, then you can write that for me, it is sensitivity which is more important. That's why you have taken sensitivity as a criteria. Or for a person, it may be specificity which is more important. So in this case, I have said that it was the sensitivity which was important. So the sample size for this study was calculated using the following assumption. The AUC, area under the curve, for lactate was assumed to be 0.8. So first I'm assuming that it should have a good discrimination power. The level of significance was 1%, the power of the study was 90%, and the hypothesis is two-sided. So the value I'll write, so AUC was 0.8, 1% was level of significance, and 90% was the power. So I'll go to the calculator here. It is another calculator which we have pasted in the chat box. You can open this. So I'll go to the calculator, or it is maybe it has already opened. So it is an easy ROC web tool for ROC analysis. In this, if you open this, you will find that in this select method, there are three drop-down menu: single test, comparison of two tests, and non-inferiority. So it is a single test for me now. So type 1 error. Here, I think I have fixed as 1%. So maybe you can fix it as 5% or 1% depending on your need. But in this case, since it has written in the input as 1%, so I'm taking it as 1%. And then power is 90% and area under the curve is 0.8. So that's why if you see the calculation of the sample size, so it will be the 42. The total sample size will be the 42. Now, coming to the example, another example. So 42 is so I will do this study on 42 individual, and then I will select a cutoff. So first I have to prove that lactate has a good to excellent discriminatory power for bacterial meningitis, and then I will find a cutoff from the ROC curve for the best, highest possible value of sensitivity and specificity. And for deciding cutoff, we calculate Jordan's index also. I don't know whether you know this Jordan's index or not. So this Jordan's index is the sensitivity plus specificity -1. So you, from the table of every cutoff, you calculate the Jordan's index, and the largest Jordan's index, whenever the largest Jordan's index falls on which cutoff, you take that cutoff to decide for your test to be positive or negative. So Jordan's index is an index which we measure, which we use to decide a cutoff. So this cutoff, maybe you can plot a ROC curve, you can see a value of each cutoff, and then you can decide. So here the protein and CSF lactate, they were significantly higher in the bacterial meningitis case. The CSF glucose was significantly lower. CSF lactate showed the best predictive ability. So the area under the curve, we assumed it to be 0.8, but actual curve, the area came to be 0.944, which has got an excellent discrimination bar. So considering they have decided with this that a cutoff of 30 they have decided, and they have calculated the sensitivity and specificity of bacterial meningitis as 84.1 and 99% respectively. So now it's your time for practice. So for you, this is one example, the role of C-reactive protein in early onset neonatal sepsis. And in this case, this is the input for you people. So the assumed area under the curve for CRP is 0.85, 5% is the level of significance, and the power of the study is 80%. So all of you please calculate So I'll also go and do it. So it is single test. And this is 0.85. And par is 80%. So it is 14. Yes, because it has got a very high, see the area under the curve is 0.85. So this value is 14. Yes, you are right. So now we will do the next assignment, that is the estimating and comparing diagnostic test accuracy of two index test. So how to do it for the two index test? This is one example, diagnostic accuracy of two questionnaire. So this is the same example which we have cited in the initial proportion one, where we were using the sensitivity and specificity. So I have told you that either you can take a cutoff and you can decide the sensitivity and specificity and use two proportion formula, or you can use a AUC. So the diagnostic, the both things you should know. What you use, that is up to you. So diagnostic accuracy, but definitely the sample size calculation using AUC is lesser as compared to sensitivity and specificity. Because remember, in the mean and proportion also, whenever you calculate the sample size using mean or a continuous variable, it is always less than the proportion. Similar concept is here. So the diagnostic accuracy of two questionnaire for the detection of a neuropathic pain, you can see here that the same questionnaire LANS and DN4, and here assumed AUC of DN4 is 0.95, assumed AUC of LANS is 0.85, and the AUC under null hypothesis for both questionnaires is 0.8. So remember, here you have to give the 4 input. So under null hypothesis, both are having 0.5 discrimination, but alternate for DN4, it is 0.95, and for LANS, it is 0.85. So I'll go here in this ROC. From the drop-down menu, you will select comparison of two tests. Error is same. Now, what input you will give this? So this is the AUC of first test under null hypothesis. So this both I have taken as 0.8, this as 0.85, and the other as 0.95. So if you calculate the sample size, it will be 318. So total 318 is the sample size. Yes, you are right. And then again, coming to the your time to practice. So HE4 and CA125, these are the two diagnostic tests for diagnosing ovarian cancer. So if you have to compare these two, so this HE4 is the human epididymis secretory protein 4, and CA125, both are used to classify patients as presenting a high or low risk of epithelial ovarian cancer. So this is a screening test. So the assumed AUC for HE4 is 0.90, and for CA125 is 0.85. 0.8 is the assumption for both in the null hypothesis. 5% is the significance and 80% is the par. So now all of you please calculate sample size. So it will be 0.90 and 0.85. So you can make this as a 0.90. So the required sample size will be the 1354. It is very huge sample size because, you know, you can see that you want to achieve a very good discrimination index, which is 0.90. That's why the calculation, the required sample size is very high. So coming to, so I think this is, that's it for today. And you can get these presentations and the PowerPoint on Merit India website, which is the http://www.meritindia.org. And here you will get the previous, to all the participants, you will get all the 5 recordings also, the previous recording. And we'll try to keep all these calculator as one single place so that you don't face any difficulty if you have to calculate the sample size. So you will get the recorded version of the presentation. The previous 5 also, it is there in the website. You may visit the website and you may see it. For ROC and AUC also, there is a session. We have taken session on SPSS, and in that session, you can come to know regarding the basics of ROC, Jordan's index, what is sensitivity, specificity, and all those concepts which were involved in today's session. Because it was a beyond of today's scope to include those concepts in the sample size made easy session. So I hope so now this is the upcoming webinar. So we are going to start a EpiWeb on applied epidemiology. And again, a sample size calculation made easy using G power. Because till now, we have used the statulator and the other calculator, but there is a calculation of sample size using G power. But for that, you need to have some basic idea about the statistics and epidemiology. Then able to grasp that. So before we build up those concepts, first we'll build up the concepts on these epidemiology and the statistics, then we may go to the G power calculation. So that's it from my end. Now I request Dr. Any other question? I think we have tried. You can write to us as support at meritindia.org. And then I think because there is a lot of chat, I think it's not possible for us to look into the questions. Okay, I don't, we are trying to scroll it down. Maybe you can write to us at support@meritindia.org regarding any other query. And over to Dr. Shamshad or Dr. Venkatesh. Over to Dr.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot for the wonderful session. Like our chat box is like overflowed with appreciation messages. Thank you so much, ma'am, and thanks to our wonderful participants who made this great event. Now, I'd like to request our vibrant faculty of our department, Dr. Samshad Ahmed sir, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Venkatesh. I think with this sixth session on sample size calculation made easy, we started our journey at around January last year. We decided to conduct a session, and we planned a sixth session. And with this we have in, and for next session we are trying to include applied epidemiology. We will keep it very lesser and lesser text lecture oriented and more applied oriented. And similarly, we find that G power also, it's an ample of opportunity that we should learn G power also, because G power a bit look is a bit complicated, but we will try to find out that the easiest way to use the G power for most of us, most of the sample size calculations. So with this, regarding the material, all the material, this workshop and remaining other workshop that are available, you may find a course named as sample size calculation made easy. And in any case, if you have any doubt or any feedback, you just write it as support@meritindia.org. So we will like that you stay connected with our website, our team of Merit India, and we will keep you updating about the next sessions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. Once again, I extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Pragya ma'am, Dr. Samshad sir, to our wonderful 1,500 plus registered participants for making this webinar a grand success. E-certificates for this session will be mailed to you within a week's time. And the recording of this session also will be available in our YouTube channel, Merit India. If you are interested to know more about our future sessions, you can always check out our department Facebook page, Department of Community and Family Medicine, AIIMS Patna. As mentioned earlier by sir and ma'am, you can visit our website www.meritindia.org to take our online courses and to avail all the materials. Hope to see you all in our next session. Thank you, everyone. We are closing now.
Here for today.